So on the campaign trail today, Donald Trump continued to sell his new extreme vetting immigration plan. He just introduced it this week, yesterday, of course. So the question is, how does it differ in substance from what the administration is already doing? Here to help break it all down, former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer and Trump campaign foreign policy advisor Carter Page.
So, Kellyanne, let me turn to the influence of Russia on this election. Question surrounding one of your advisors. On March 21st, Trump spokeswoman Hope Hicks confirmed to CNN that Carter Page was a foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump, and that same day Trump himself identified Carter Page as a member of the Trump campaign foreign policy team during a meeting with the Washington Post. Both these stories still on your campaign website. We now learned from Yahoo News that Mr. Page has opened up private communications with senior Russian officials about lifting economic sanctions. Has your campaign spoken with Mr. Page about this?
Well, I have not spoken with him at all. In fact, meaning he's not part of our national security or foreign policy briefings that we do now at all. Certainly not since I become campaign manager. And so
is he not part of the campaign anymore? He's not part of the campaign anymore?
He's certainly not part of the campaign that I'm running, meaning we don't have him. We have a number of people, fabulous people, men and women, as part of our national security and foreign policy team, and he's not among them at Trump Tower. And I also will say, if he's doing that, he's certainly not doing it with the permission or the knowledge of the campaign, the activities that you described.
So if he's out there talking to Russian officials, he's not doing so on behalf of the Trump campaign in any way, shape, or form?
He is certainly not authorized to do that.
Was there ever an offer that helped to lift the sanctions? You'd get something out of it?
If I were offered a prize of many billions of dollars, that would be quite an offer. But that was never dropped in my lap. No.
Can you answer that question? Was there ever any offer like that at all?
No offer whatsoever. No hint of an offer. No pathway to anything resembling an offer or even a discussion on these range of issues.
That you'd get something if you got the sanctions lifted.
Not something, not something worth $1, let alone something worth billions of dollars.
But my first question then, after that, Carter Page, is to ask you, you're aware of these reports out there that there were officials in the Trump campaign who were in repeated contact with Russian officials, Russian intelligence officials, during 2016. Were you one of those campaign officials?
Well, Judy, that going back to the question to Sean Spicer about fake news. I mean, yes, I'm aware of the reports, which I saw on the front page of the New York Times today, but I think, I can actually answer that question as to why that was fake news. That was just a regurgitation of old reports based on the dodgy dossier that the Clinton campaign came out with.
So in other words,
yes, I'm aware of these ongoing public relations attacks against the administration and people who have supported it. But
did you have any meetings last year with Russian officials in Russia, outside Russia, anywhere?
I had no meetings, no meetings. I might have said hello to a few people, as they're walking by me at my the graduation speech I gave in July, but no meetings.
Are you cooperating with any federal investigators who are looking into this? Have you been asked, for example, by the FBI or another agency to answer questions? And if you were called on to go before, say, a Senate committee investigation, would you be willing to do that?
I've never been asked by anyone in the FBI or any of the other agencies. No one from the FBI has ever contacted me. It's all a complete sham investigation, just played up by the opponents of Mr. Trump.
But you did tell the New York Times that you are under investigation.
I never said anywhere. I said actually.
Well, they actually put it to you that you are under investigation.
Yeah, that's various leaks by people internally in the deep state that are pushing against Mr. Trump.
What is deep state?
It is, that's a long discussion, but there are...
Basically, you feel that there's a section of the United States administration that's against you?
Not administration. I just say, people within the government that are
intelligence
holdovers.
Officers?
Well, I think, the best example I can give you is Sally Yates, the person who was pushing back the temporary acting attorney general. And, I think if I had to guess, she was certainly part of some of the attacks against General Flynn, and I wouldn't be surprised.
So you regret the passing of General Flynn?
absolutely.
He was
Great.
straight as a die.
He is a individual of great integrity. And I think, if you're working
You know the
17,
mystery?
18
Nobody's been able to work out why on earth he's gone.
Well, listen, if you're
He
working
lied to the vice president.
if you're working 18-hour days and,
He lied to the vice president.
I was
Lying's
not
not a
part
good
of his,
idea.
I was not
And
part
you're
of
not
his
telling me any
conversation.
lies about agencies inspecting your background.
They may very well be. Actually, I expect they are if you listen to some of these news reports.
So let's just get to the sort of essence of all this. And some of it has to do with the sale of the oil company, Rosneft's actual, value to Glencore. I think it was about $11 billion. And it is said that you may have taken a commission, or you might get a commission.
The interesting thing about Glencore, if you look at the history of that company, that was actually founded by Mark Rich, the person that Bill Clinton pardoned in his final days in office, very controversially. So I have no contacts at Glencore.
So you've never had anything to do with either of
does.
them? You've never had anything to do with either the oil company or with Glencore?
I know some people at Rosneft. It's the largest oil company in Russia. So,
Did you have anything to do with the takeover?
Absolutely zero.
How can you be a foreign policy advisor if the one area which is your expertise, Russia, isn't part of the deal?
Well, it's interesting. All the questions are always focused on Russia.
But is it surprising? You worked for Merrill Lynch there.
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
there for a long time.
Yep.
You had lots of good friends in Russia, lots
Certainly.
of good friends in the system. But you're telling me none of that was ever drawn upon by Mr. Trump?
That was completely, a big distraction just to, yes, I know a lot of people, but I know a lot of people in China, in Africa, in Middle East.
So you are...
So many ambassadors that I met in Cleveland from around the world at the Republican National Convention always started asking
but
very
none
tough
of
questions.
that's happened since he was president.
But they
I
were
asked you as
talking
president.
but they were talking about a lot of the same false accusations and misrepresentations, and a lot of that goes back to the fake news issue.
Well,
the
the
wrong
fake news
information.
issue is some...
I'm glad to have you here because you are at the center of the news today. USA Today saying that you and an individual named J.D. Gordon, another advisor, met with Sergei Kislyak at the RNC in Cleveland. Is that true?
Well, Chris, it's interesting because that one of those pieces from the Washington Post that you showed, it starts out with a discussion of a meeting that I participated in with Prime Minister Modi, quoting a number of sources that about things that I supposedly said which were completely false.
Right. But,
so that meeting was off the record, and I'm not talking about any or that entire conference, which was
which one are you talking about? At the RNC.
At the RNC.
You intended.
Yeah.
There's a conference that's put together, and I just want to give people the context here. It's not like you're in some back alley with a Russian ambassador. There's a bunch of ambassadors who come in. It's actually something that's done every year. But you did, in fact, meet with Sergei Kislyak there.
I'm not talking about any meetings that I had there because I learned confidentiality rules when I served in the U.S. Navy, and I'm sticking with the commitment that I made to the organizers that I would be, keep it an off-the-record meeting. So I'm not going to talk about individual discussions or people I may or may not have met with.
Okay, so USA Today has reported this. You're not going to confirm or deny. I have to say though, 2 weeks ago you were with Judy Woodruff, and she said, "Did you have any meetings? Any meetings last year with Russian officials, inside Russia, outside Russia, anywhere?" You said, "I had no meetings, no meetings."
No meetings related to those issues which were being brought out, or she was asking about, which was another front page New York. I can't remember if that was.
Wait a second. I just want to be clear. You're now, when you said I had no meetings, you are now amending that to say no meetings relating to the issues specific to what Judy Woodruff was talking about.
She was specifically talking about the investigation, which I believe came out that same day or the day previous. So that was the context.
Just for a straight answer, you're saying I can't confirm or deny. USA Today's reported it. You told one reporter I had no meetings with the Russians. Now you're telling me I had no meetings with the Russians about the things they were talking about. I'm just trying to get a straight answer. Like, did you meet Sergei Kislyak in Cleveland? Did you talk to him?
I'm not going to deny that I talked with him. Although
so you did talk to him.
I will say that I never met him anywhere outside of Cleveland. Let's just say that much.
The only time that you met him was in Cleveland.
that I may have met him possibly might have been in Cleveland. So
okay.
Again, I'm respectful to the organizers. I'm respectful to confidentiality rules.
Okay.
And whether it's in government or outside.
But you're not going to deny that you talked with him in Cleveland.
I do not deny that.
Okay.
I never directly briefed Donald Trump. I was part of a named committee, which was put together.
So you were part of the committee that advised the campaign.
That's a fair
Okay.
assessment. Yes.
What did you do in that role and capacity?
You know, similarly, I don't like talking about internal discussions. It's the old first rule of Fight Club: you don't talk about Fight Club.
The head of Rosneft, Igor Sechin, former Putin chief of staff, Sergei Ivanov. These are two individuals the dossier alleges you met with. Did you meet with either of those individuals?
You know, what's so interesting about that, Chris, so Rosneft.
Yes.
There's been
the
all
largest
sorts
oil company in Russia. Yep.
Exactly. There's been so many reports about the sale.
Wait, before you tell me that,
yeah.
is that a simple yes or no question? Did you meet with either of those individuals?
No, never.
Did you ever act as essentially a liaison for the Trump campaign while you were in Russia? Were you talking to people about what the Trump campaign's plans for Russian policy were?
Absolutely not, no. And you know, I mean, it's interesting, going back to the Rosneft issue. Who actually bought Rosneft?
We don't know.
Well, it is known. It is known. It's public record that it's Glencore. And who is the founder of Glencore?
Yes, Mark
A guy
Rich.
named Mark
Yes,
Rich.
yes, right.
So, you know, if you want to ask someone about Mark Rich,
right.
I mean, the Clintons are better people to ask
Right,
about.
but you have no independent view about the intelligence agencies about Russia doing this. You take their word for it, or you just have no independent view of it?
I'm pretty skeptical about it. And I actually, in a letter I wrote to the Civil Rights Division at Department of Justice, outlining some of the crimes that were committed against me during the campaign, I actually included as a Appendix B, a list of things where there's big questions surrounding that.
The most fevered imagination of people about this is that essentially there were back channel conversations in which agents or associates of the Trump campaign were communicating with agents or associates of Vladimir Putin, his surrogates, or Russian intelligence to collude for the Trump campaign. At any time, did you have liaisons with anyone in Russia in which you were talking about the hacking that was going on or things the campaign might do?
Not only, I had absolutely no involvement with that, and again, it'll be interesting when the details about the categorically no, and it'll be interesting when they have this paper trail of what the intelligence community was doing, looking at the collusion between the efforts by the Clinton campaign and members of the Obama administration during those months. Everything about me is completely false and just so inaccurate. You know, this Rosneft stake, for example. A stake which actually was bought by Glencore, company founded by Mark Rich, right. You know, who's long history there. You probably remember. No one from from the DOJ or FBI or any member of the executive branch of government has ever contacted me over the course of the last year. I was actually excited when I got back from my trip overseas yesterday, because I received a letter from, you were asking about committees as well. Right. I got a nice letter from the Senate Select Intelligence Committee asking me to preserve my some of my information for, you know.
So, and you just got that yesterday?
Well, I mean, it was dated a couple weeks ago, but I've been traveling the last few weeks. And I actually tried dialing the number for the Senate contact, the Senate Select Committee's contact, to make sure that they're doing both campaigns and going to look at, you know, the very clear evidence of interfering in the election and kind of using the intelligence community to for political acts.
You spent a lot of time in Russia, and you don't think about what Russian intelligence is capable of?
What I think about.
You're telling me you don't carry a second phone when you go to Moscow because you know that they're going to hack into your phone? Listen, everybody who goes to Moscow does that. Do you do that?
You know what?
Do you do
yeah,
that?
I do have a second phone.
Okay,
but,
so you carry a second phone when you go to Moscow because you know Russian intelligence is likely to hack into your phone, but you can't imagine that Russian intelligence would hack into the DNC?
I didn't say that. What I said is if you read that intel report.
If you don't use a second phone in Russia, I got to tell you, you should, because you're the only person I've ever met who does business in Russia and doesn't do that.
Well, like I just said, I do have that.
Okay.
You know, for.
Carter Page. Who's he? That's what everybody said at the time when, unprompted, then candidate Donald Trump volunteered him as the #2 name on his list of foreign policy advisors, the first time he had ever listed foreign policy advisors for his campaign. Well, now, BuzzFeed News reports that among the many other things that Carter Page turns out to be, he was also recruited in 2013 as apparently an unwitting American source for a Russian spy ring that was operating out of New York City. Joining us now is Ali Watkins. She's a national security correspondent for BuzzFeed News, who broke this story tonight. Thank you for being here. Congratulations on the scoop.
Thanks for having me.
Can I ask you about one detail of this that strikes me as really weird?
Okay.
When we found out that you guys had this scoop today, we were like scrambling. We're like, oh, that's the VEB case. Let's go back and look at that indictment. This must mean mail what? Like, we're putting it together as we're getting this news from you guys. In terms of Carter Page and his appearance in this spy saga, do we know anything about what he handed over, what he gave these Russian spies who were trying to cultivate him?
Well, there's a couple things that we know. Page was not in the government at that time, and there's nothing to indicate that there was anything sensitive. There would be really, it's hard to imagine him having a lot of access to sensitive information at that time. He was not in Trump's orbit. As I said, he was a private sector employee.
It's 2013, so nobody was in Trump's political orbit at the time.
Yeah,
right?
true. But he didn't have access to anything sensitive governmentally. So it does not appear that he handed over anything sensitive.
Why did Carter Page confirm this to you, and what was his affect toward this information and it becoming public?
He was very forthcoming with it. I had been doing a lot of reporting on it, so knew that it was him in the document. Mm-hmm. And when I asked him about it, he said, "Yes, I'm male one." I'm paraphrasing, but he confirmed that he's the anonymous male in the document.
So you were able to figure this out before you got the confirmation from him. Obviously, the icing on the cake is him saying, "Yeah, it's me." Mm-hmm. The reason I want to be super clear about that is because we just heard then candidate Donald Trump there naming him as one of his foreign policy advisors. In fact, naming as the second person he came up with on the initial list of foreign policy advisors. Isn't this the sort of thing that should have kind of turned up in vetting?
I mean, that's the question moving forward, right? Is what did the Trump administration know and when did they know it, essentially? Again, really want to be clear here. This was 3 years before Page had any kind of connection to the campaign. Again, doesn't appear it was anything sensitive. But it is questions. I mean, clearly this was a known fact in certain corners of the Bureau and certain corners in New York. And as I said, Page was very forthcoming with it. So I think that is the question tomorrow is what did the Trump administration know and when did they know it?
And even if Page was himself an unwitting cultivated asset, we know that he knows it happened to him because the FBI went and told him that's what happened to him when they interviewed him at the time.
Yeah,
so had he been vetted, even just being directly asked, have you ever been in contact with a foreign intelligence service, he would have had to say yes.
Presumably, yeah, if you want to answer truthfully.
So the Washington Post, as you know, has reported that last year the FBI went to a FISA judge and argued successfully that there was probable cause to believe that you were acting as an agent for a foreign government. So my question is, were you?
Of course I wasn't, Jake. It's just such a joke that it's beyond words. And what's interesting about it is March 20th, Director Comey, he made the point that people can lie to the press, people can lie to the American public all they want in politics. What's interesting about last night's report is if it's true, well, there's a different standard when it comes to evidence in court. So all of this false evidence that you've been hearing about myself with the dodgy dossier and other false reports going back through most of the last summer, well, that will have very different implications. So this is a real game changer if it turns out to be true.
What do you mean it's a game changer? How is it a game changer? I mean, at least 2 times that we know of, the FBI has investigated your links with Russians. In 2016, last year, when they went to the FISA court and got a court order and received permission to monitor your communications. And earlier, as you know, in 2013, the FBI interviewed you. You were dealing with a man named Viktor Podobny, who was charged later with being an unregistered agent of a foreign government. So that was 2013. At the time, did you have any idea that Podobny was a Russian spy?
I talk to diplomats all the time. I'm based in New York a good portion of the time. The United Nations is based here. You're always meeting with foreign diplomats. And the reality is, whenever you talk to a foreign government representative, the assumption is that on some level, it's going to go back to the government in question. So again, I never gave him any information which is material or classified or in any way improper. And the assumption is that it would go back. So it's quite an irrelevant question, in my view.
Well, it's not irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. I mean, there is, if you meet the German ambassador or the French ambassador, maybe they'll pass on the information. But we're talking about clandestine services, and he was charged in the U.S. with being an unregistered foreign agent. So I guess my question more specifically is, okay, you knew that he was Russian, but did you know he was a spy?
I did not know he was a spy when I first met him, although
okay. Did you
eventually it came out. Yeah.
Did you think he was trying to recruit you or get intelligence that would have been inappropriate for you to have shared?
He never made any indication that he was trying to recruit me. It was all just a casual conversation, exactly what I told my students at New York University. So, and no offer was made, and there was no negotiation whatsoever. I met at a conference at Asia Society, and at some point later, within a month or so, I believe, it was several years ago, we had coffee once, had a slight conversation. I gave him a couple of my information from my lectures, some public research reports, and that was the end of it.
Have you talked to the FBI about their Russia investigation? Have you been interviewed by them or questioned by them in any way?
I tried asking Lisa Monaco at a breakfast meeting in early January about the ongoing allegations about FISA warrants, which had been coming out about me going back to October. And she avoided the question completely, and she also made the point that we don't talk about any ongoing investigations. And again, I've always respected confidentiality. I have nothing to say about any ongoing investigations that may or may not be going on. Kislyak, I said hello to briefly in Cleveland, so that was nothing.
So everything over in Russia was incidental?
Less than incidental.
Okay. What about this banker, the Russian banker that you knew here in New York?
I didn't actually know him. There was this case against a few operatives that were here, and I happen to know one of the diplomats that was based here. And I deal with diplomats all the time at the UN, et cetera. So just brief
expand on that a little bit. So the Russian diplomats you bump into in what capacity?
So in this example, one of my business partners from Asia was speaking at Asia Society on Park Avenue. I happened to say hello to him, and we struck up a little dialogue, and I met him once for coffee, offered him some ideas. That was about it. Yeah.
What time frame is this?
This was 2013. And we'll cross that bridge.
Why did Susan Rice get involved in this? For what reason? Was it national security interests?
I wrote my Trident Scholar project at the Naval Academy, doing research on using information as a political weapon, that both in the executive branch and legislative branch of government, this was information as a political weapon.
What evidence do you believe a FISA court judge would have reviewed to come to a conclusion that there was strong case, probable cause, that you committed a crime? Surely there was something.
That is a beautiful question, Michael. There is no possibility of probable cause. The basis, you mentioned the 2013 and the case that was filed in 2015. I was asked to give information, and I provided information. So I did nothing wrong in that case. It's interesting, one of the prior questions, and this goes back to the issue of leaking, Chris, because in several of the prior discussions, for example, with Anderson Cooper and others, is the constant questions regarding, did I ever meet Ambassador Kislyak? And I said a brief hello to him and in Cleveland, and maybe a few passing comments, never lasting more than just a few seconds. And it's interesting. The reason why I wasn't more forthcoming about that with Anderson about a month and a half ago is I never It was a confidential meeting. Everyone that was in that meeting agreed they would keep the conversations confidential, and I was respecting that. And so the reason why I can talk about it now is the Kremlin spokesperson, Mr. Peskov, has said that yes, there were various interactions between the supporters of the Trump campaign as well as the Clinton campaign, I would mention.
But Carter,
it was interesting watching President Obama's speech at a Chicago university earlier this week, where he was talking about encouraging people to get more involved in the political process, not necessarily being direct politicians, and all the dirty things that go along with that, but just as private citizens, which is exactly what I did. And the disclaimer, which should have been on that in that speech that he gave, was make sure that you don't say anything which could be construed as questioning the powers in currently in authority, because then you'll have a domestic political intelligence operation
so correct me if I'm wrong.
Focused on you. The most recent Dodgy dossier of 2016 was used as a false basis, saying that there is probable cause when there is absolutely zero probable
remember,
cause.
A federal judge, you want to make this a political thing, you can, but a federal judge looked at the evidence and found probable cause. And if you look at the facts, they certainly line up in favor of asking you some questions. 2013, you were talking to a guy who you said you didn't know was a spy, turned out to be a spy. Now we have indications that they were working you, whether you were aware or not, trying to get access to the campaign. That's relevant. You then go to Russia. We don't know whether or not the Trump campaign asked you to go, knew that you were going, concerted action with you in going, because you won't say so. It fuels speculation enough such that the DOJ went and got a warrant to surveil you.
But most people in the campaign are denying kind of knowing you. So I'm just trying to get, you won't say who brought you into the campaign. You won't say what the topic of, policy papers, which you've said you actually sent are. So it's not clear to me exactly how real you were a part of this campaign, other than how you portrayed yourself when you were in Moscow.
I think, as I've explained to a number of people, Anderson, I was not a substantial part of the campaign. I've been very upfront about that throughout.
But when you get interrogated by the FBI, that feels like heat, doesn't it?
Well, it's interesting.
I mean, have you ever been interrogated by the FBI before?
Not about me specifically. I have, and as I mentioned to Director Comey back in September when I offered to help, I've helped both the FBI and CIA on other things in the past. We've had tens of hours of discussions, and I've spent a lot of time in Langley previously. So it's been an ongoing dialogue.
Why have you been spending a lot of time with the FBI and CIA over the years?
Sometimes you're asked. I mean, I think it's pretty well known.
No, not sometimes you're asked. I've never. Yeah. Asked for what? Why?
It is very often the agencies ask for background on things that are happening around the world, and very often I've offered insights.
You have said that FBI agents in March, they questioned you specifically on this probe.
Yeah. Well,
what were they asking you about?
It's interesting because almost everything to some extent was based on all those false allegations in the Dodgy dossier.
They were asking
so
you.
It's so encouraging. You talk about obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
One of the aspects of obstruction of justice is false evidence. So I have a number of appeals out under the Privacy Act to get the court warrant, which is supposedly as thick as a wrist. And so let's see what's in that court warrant and whether there's false evidence in that, because then we're really talking about false evidence, Chris.
Will you tell me what they asked you about? Like, what'd they ask you?
Read the Dodgy dossier.
Like, they were asking you, basically, based on the dossier, they were asking you, did you meet with this person? Did you meet with that person?
In broad terms. Again, I don't want to dig into specifics, but everything to a large extent was related to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know Roger Stone? Have you ever talked to him?
I had one conversation with Roger Stone. Very interesting conversation, actually.
Everyone with Roger Stone is an interesting conversation.
Well, it was, I said hello to him briefly last May at a book signing for the Clinton's War on Women. And he asked me one question.
Yes.
He said, and I told him I'm a supporter and I'm helping out some people on the foreign policy front. He asked me, are you a neocon? I said to him, the answer was, Roger, I am about the farthest thing away on the spectrum from a neocon.
Well, this is the idea you have. Every time that I've seen you on television, whether you've been on this show or other shows, people that I know that are lawyers tear their hair out. The question is, what are you doing? You are the subject of a federal investigation. You're talking to FBI interrogators. This is very serious, high-stakes stuff. You are going on television without an attorney. Why are you doing that?
Chris, if I felt that there was anything even close to being wrong with anything I've done, not only over the last 24 months, the time horizon that they're looking at here, but really going back over the course of the last quarter century since my first trip to Moscow in the summer of 1991, then I would be concerned and I would be holding myself back. But if you look at all the false information, and frankly, I disagree with many of your past speakers, Representative Waters. I actually knew her husband, Ambassador Williams, when I was officer on the USS Carr, when we did a port visit down there. The future of diplomacy and fixing this current narrative and this current terrible trajectory that we're on comes down to acting like Ambassador Williams in terms of diplomacy and having a better approach.
So you just feel like, I got nothing to hide. I'm going to talk to whoever I talk to.
Absolutely. There was a false report last week saying that I walked in off the street and I talked with Ed Cox, who's the chairman of the New York Republican Party here, and he ended up having a conversation with them to set the record straight that it was he that introduced me.
Do you believe that the Russians hacked into the DNC and the rest of the effort to try to manipulate this election?
I'm not fully convinced about that.
You're not convinced of that?
I think January 6th was largely a political stunt.
What's that?
Just the 2 weeks before the election, without much basis. I think there's I have a lot of questions about that January 6th report.
The report, the
DNI report. The DNI report.
What was your why were you brought into the campaign if it wasn't because of your Russian expertise?
I can't speak to that, Chris. I have done a lot in international relations going back throughout most of my life, since serving in the Navy, since U.S.-Russia arms control negotiations in the Pentagon. I've done tens of billions of dollars of energy deals. So
what's behind it? What's the big elephant in the room we're trying to figure out here? Because everybody's trying to figure it out.
It's a fake elephant, Chris. That's the whole thing.
In other words, your meetings, the secret meetings, didn't accomplish anything. Nothing happened.
Absolutely not. Nothing.
Nothing.
I was a little small fry.
But you have a goal?
Chris, in the grand scheme of things, the biggest thing I ended up doing is responding to all these fake reports that kept coming out against me, particularly.
But at this point, there are no fake reports.
Well,
because
it's pretty early.
Well, no, but it's March, right?
Yes.
So emails.
The only hacking I heard about emails is from the Washington Post and New York Times about my emails getting hacked with this fake FISA warrant that was, based on the dodgy dossiers. It's funny, Jake. It was actually that on September 25th, 2016, Kellyanne Conway, who I've never met, you were asking a bunch of questions about these totally false allegations, which were made up in the dodgy dossier. And here she is, you talk about sort of distractions and things being thrown at people. She, someone who I've never met, who had joined the campaign not too recently, is getting thrown this crazy question.
Well, it wasn't, I remember the question, and it wasn't about anything in the dossier, and I didn't even know the dossier existed at that time. It was about a newspaper report about you meeting with Russians.
It was an online report. Yes.
Okay.
So you're saying tonight that you have never met Igor, I always forget his name, Sechin. You've never met him.
I've never met him in my entire life. And what's interesting about it, if you do the math on that, the 19% had a market value of about $11 billion. So if you think I'm going to get paid off some way, that seems like a pretty hefty sum.
That's pretty good. I'm going to borrow some money from you someday.
As you know, you can't get a warrant like this, a wiretapping warrant like this, unless they can demonstrate probable cause you were working as a foreign agent. And you actually had been on the FBI's radar for working for Russia for several years. You were the target of a Russian recruitment effort back in 2013. The FBI interviewed you about that, correct?
I was a witness to a case that they were doing. So I was supporting the FBI in that case.
Right. You gave documents, though, to someone they believe they charged with espionage.
See, this is sort of spin because I gave them, I was teaching a course down Broadway here at NYU, and I told him a couple of things about what I was talking about in my course, and I gave him a couple of my notes from, or the documents that I gave my students. So in terms of, it sounds, you know, when you say giving documents to a quote-unquote spy, and, you know, it's
well,
a couple of courses.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds a lot worse than reality, but that's reality.
Did you ever imagine that your government would be spying on you at any point?
Well, I mean, I had some warnings about that back in, starting in the summer of 2016 and into September. And actually, when I sent my letter to Director Comey on September 25th, 2016, I was, you know, I immediately called this out as a witch hunt. And so I had some advance warning about that. And I also warned him about, you know, and I said, instead of allowing the staff of the FBI to focus limited resources on real threats, these desperate and unfounded calls for my investigation as a private citizen are a true disgrace. Actually, what I've been having a hard time believing is going back to the original testimony by Mr. Comey on March 20th last year, where, you know, the members of the House Intelligence Committee were reading from that dodgy dossier extensively, and, you know, all the damage that created and, you know, challenges it created for our country and the U.S. government is just terrible. And, you know, his false answers about Trump Tower was not wiretapped, well, that's all been proven incorrect based on this new.
So do you believe that they were using you as a doorway to get into all of these other Trump communications?
Of course.
And do you think that they got anything from that?
Well, I think, you know, it's the principle of it. And I mean, that's the thing. I was a low-level guy, right?
But are we going to see at any stage of this that, oh, this actually all comes back to this one phone conversation that started when we got into the Carter Page?
Well, the one phone conversation, you know, will be interesting. I think Chairman Grassley and Chairman Graham on the Senate Judiciary they have some outstanding requests out to members of the Clinton campaign to get information about their, you know, their operations with the dodgy dossier creator. So we'll see how that all plays out, and I think that'll really help.
Are you suing the U.S. government over what they did?
Absolutely. And, you know, there's two parts. And again, it goes back to this January 6, 2017 Intel report. They allege hacking and they allege false propaganda. I'm focused right now on the false propaganda. And that's, you know, imminently clear that the U.S. government was funding this big campaign. And so
while in Moscow, you had brief encounters with people that may have been senior government officials.
I said hello. You know, one of the other speakers at the New Economic School was a government official. I said hello as he was walking down the street off the stage.
That's the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia?
Yes.
10 seconds.
Not even. You know, and I've been asking to try to get footage of that, and I've been asked about that in various interrogations, you know, literally for hours.
Your Schiff memo that was released in response to the Nunes memo, it says the FBI interviewed you multiple times about your Russian intelligence contacts, including in March of 2016, which is right around when you come onto the campaign. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, that is true.
Yes.
We don't have any way of knowing it. So what was that about?
Well, you know, things will eventually be declassified, I believe. Sure. But it relates to, you know, not long after that interview where we were talking, you know, there was a leak about the whole Mail One situation where I was a witness to this spy case.
There was, let me just so people know, in the Southern District of New York, there was a case brought against people that were ultimately, I think, convicted, right, of being Russian agents. And they refer to people they were trying to recruit. One of them is putatively you. They refer to you as Mail One. So you're saying it's in relationship to that case?
Let's just, yes.
But that happens, I just want to be clear here, because one of the things I think that you've contended for a while and your supporters have contended is that it was the Steele dossier that essentially is what makes your life terrible, right? This dodgy
Well, that's
dossier.
what happened before the election, right? You know, 45 days before the election, there's this defamatory story that comes out.
That's your perspective on this, and I know that. But I guess my only point is that this March 2016 interview is happening before them. Dossier.
Okay, yes, and I was a witness, yes.
And you were a witness. You talked to the FBI. Your big complaint is that and this is essentially the argument of the Nunes memo, is that the foreign surveillance warrant issued against you was wrong. It was improper. It should never have been issued against you, and that it shouldn't have been subsequently renewed multiple times, right? That's your contention.
I can't imagine anything which could possibly warrant such a warrant.
Are you on the same page? My feeling about it is I just want to know I want to read the warrant.
Absolutely. Yes.
Like, just declassify the warrant, let Carter Page and Chris Hayes and everyone else read it, and come to a determination about whether it was proper or whether it was improper.
Which is, we're completely on the same page. It was forced out of me in the House Intelligence Committee with in this 8-hour day where I'm just being grilled nonstop, that, I had a brief conversation with Steve Bannon and, things like that.
He told you not to come on my show.
It wasn't your show. It was
okay. Well, I don't feel as insulted by Steve Bannon then. All right, Carter.
We're not mentioning the informant's name, but Carter, when did you first meet this informant that we now know is an informant? And just briefly tell us about that exchange.
Well, again, similar to you in terms of being cautious about identity, I have also, I never knew anything about the person I was speaking with, who's a university professor at Cambridge in the UK at the time. I was invited to participate in a conference in July of 2016, and everything seemed totally normal. And frankly, I've been falsely accused myself, and we'll see what happens in terms of, as further details come out. But based on everything I've seen thus far, we still don't have any information. I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, and we'll see. Maybe this individual who we're talking about might have been a little bit nicer than I might otherwise have expected. Although, we were talking about all of the abuses that were happening with this dodgy dossier, which was first debuted in September 2016 as a way of damaging the Trump campaign and basically destroying myself. And so, and he always seemed very sympathetic about that. So again, we'll see. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. People that know him in Washington, in senior circles that I've spoken with afterwards, say, he seemed like a pretty decent guy. I actually, spoke very positively. I got a positive impression about this informant, and a couple of the people I mentioned him to in the campaign, I was a pretty positive endorsement. So I hope and pray that, all these allegations turn out to be false. And part of why I'm somewhat open about my communications with him is that it'll lead to some truth finally from the Department of Justice.
Do you remember when you first came into contact with this confidential informant?
Yeah, I was attending an academic conference at Cambridge University. Madeleine Albright was there, a lot of other senior people from the Clinton campaign.
This was in the summer of
July 2016.
Okay. Was there anything unusual about your conversations with this guy?
I never found anything unusual whatsoever. And there's a lot of allegations out there right now.
Was that the first time you'd met him? As far as you remember?
Absolutely. We ended up staying in contact for over a year. So, but it's someone, you typically meet people and
the contact for over the year, was it just by email? Did you see him again?
We met up several times, yep.
Did he ask you to come back to England to meet up to discuss things?
No, I never. That was the only time I ever met him in England. So it was always in sort of the Beltway.
You've also accused the Clinton campaign of human rights abuses, going after you because you're a man and because you're a Christian or Catholic, I believe, or saying anti-Catholic.
Look, I mean, what is well-founded, and again, it's their lawyers from Perkins Coie that have admitted to this. They were paying for this dodgy dossier. That came out finally last October. So, a lot of the allegations, things we were talking about last March when we were having our conversation, a lot keeps being proven true, and it only gets worse.
I am just sort of a sacrificial lamb, for people that are just looking to create a false story to tear down the Trump campaign.
Tell me about your business background in Moscow, because that's what you were bringing to the table. You weren't a well-known figure in foreign policy circles, but you did have some substantial experience in Moscow. Tell me about that.
You know, and this is another misnomer, right, where people play up that I'm just the Russia guy, right? And I think that was part of the reason I was such a central target when they wanted to start this witch hunt, false storyline about, you know, some corrupt intent or quote-unquote collusion with Moscow. Well, here's someone who actually lived there and worked there. You know, I've worked in a lot of other countries, and you know, I lived in London for many years. And more recently, you know, I had been doing things in Africa and Middle East and hadn't been back to Russia for several years. So to kind of, you know, falsely frame me, which I know is sort of the conventional wisdom, as the quote-unquote Russia guy, I think is a complete misnomer, you know, consistent with a lot of other misnomers.
Did you meet Igor Sechin on your visit to Moscow?
Never. I never met him then, and I never met him at any time in my life.
And did you meet Devikin?
The interesting thing about that is when I start getting all these phone calls from reporters, the operatives in Washington started trying to plant this false story in late July 2016. And I kept getting these calls constantly, asking me these same two names from the dodgy dossier, which wasn't revealed until the following January. That second name, Sechin, is a well-known figure. Devikin, you know, not only had I never even heard his name, I started asking around, because I want to, if I say something, I want to make sure that I'm saying the correct thing. So I started calling around and asking basically everyone, you know, I had been with in Moscow, asking him, you know, have you ever heard of Devikin? And they didn't even, or might he have been someone that I said hello to at some point? Even they hadn't heard of him. These are people living in Moscow. You know, he's an unknown figure, so it's complete nonsense.
Did you tell Ali Watkins that you were man number one in the FBI investigation?
Well, it's funny, Martha, in that little clip you had on Rachel Maddow's show, she's saying that I admitted it. You know, in our meeting, you know, right before that story came out, she says, I'm about to report this. I have confirmation from various sources in Washington, obviously without explaining who the sources are. And, you know, this is coming out. And really, going back to the whole masking element, it's pretty clear that, you know, anyone that knows much about me, there's not many people that could have referred to in that indictment. So, you know, I didn't really confirm per se, but it's sort of,
she said, oh, it was easy. He just, you know, admitted it right off the bat. But you think that she was getting that confirmation from her other source. How do you think that James Wolf was involved in all of this? Because you were working with him, you know, oh, I'm coming in on Tuesday, I'm going to be testifying, thinking that the head of security for this committee is going to be someone that you could trust, I would imagine.
the sad part about it is, Martha, I was objecting to both Chairman Burr, but also Senator Warner and the whole committee staff, that these various leaks are coming out. And you cited the MSNBC report where there was a stakeout and they're waiting for me. And I knew that was coming. And the sad part about it is, you know, I've suffered from various death threats going back, you know, over, you know, a couple years now. And this, it was, they had sort of died down a little bit, but when this false spin starts coming out about, you know, subpoenas, et cetera, they, you know, it continued again. And I specifically mentioned this to them, and, you know, not much interest, and sort of this media buzz approach that they've been taking just continued and continued.
You've talked about it being a witch hunt. In what way was it not a legitimate inquiry?
Everyone expected that the Democratic candidate, you know, the DNC's chosen successor, was going to become the next president of the United States. When they were very disappointed on November 8th, 2016, they have to find some way of, you know, justifying and explaining that away. So again, it's similar to the Salem witch trials many centuries ago. So there's, in every way, it's a witch hunt.
Why would the federal government want to read your emails and spy on you in ways we may not even know about? What did they think you were doing exactly?
Well, I think, as we learned with the first Inspector General report from a couple of weeks ago, I call it Inspector IG Report 1.0, there's a lot of political motivations behind what was happening earlier in the presidential election campaigns. And I think what is a lot of evidence that has come out both from House Intelligence Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee, House Judiciary, as well as others, there was a lot of abuses going on. So, I think it's completely political. There's nothing substantive to this whatsoever.
So this isn't just Christopher Steele or James Comey. This is many, many people over 2 administrations, 4 judges appointed by Republicans over and over, believing that you are an agent of a foreign power. How do you respond to that?
Actually, it'd be a good question for them, Jake, is whether they believe that what they did was appropriate now. Again, they were misled. And if people are giving them, typically when the Department of Justice is giving a court information, I think it's reasonable for a judge to believe that that's true. Unfortunately, Mr. Berman, Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, has been doing similar things, including a number of false pleadings in my case there. So I'm hoping that Department of Justice will take steps to start correcting the false record in a number of courts. The FISA is just the first part. Let's see what they do in Southern District of New York to try to correct the record.
Most of the FISA application, as you know, has been redacted, the publicly released version, but some of the material in there is there. Let's talk about some of the things in there. It says, quote, the FBI believes Carter Page has been the subject of targeted recruitment by the Russian government, and then it's redacted, and then it says, undermine and influence the outcome of the 2016 U.S. presidential election in violation of U.S. criminal law. It says that the Russians were trying to recruit you. We know you've said that you went to Russia in the summer of 2016 to deliver a commencement address. Is it not a possibility that Russians were trying to recruit you, even if you didn't take the bait? Is that not possible? It seems to me like that would be their job, and you were working for Trump. You'd worked with the Kremlin in the past. That would be a reasonable thing for them to try to do.
It's totally unreasonable, Jake, and it actually speaks to another misleading testimony related to the indictments that Eric Holder and Preet Bharara submitted on January 2015, talking about that prior case. And, a lot of that is incorrect spin. That individual, Mr. Podobny, a young diplomat in New York, I talked with him about my class. We had coffee one time. I met him at a conference at Asia Society. We met once for coffee, and I gave him some of my class notes, that my students at New York University were looking at. And it was in one ear and out the other. He never asked me to do anything. I mean, it's just so preposterous. I have my case against the U.S. government, but and they keep, similar to the FISA court, Southern District of New York keeps giving these false testimonies to the
about
court.
You.
About, I have a case against the U.S. government and, the fake news propaganda.
So you have lawsuits that you're moving.
Absolutely.
And you don't even want any money, you told me.
$1, just, nominal.
Well, how do you pay your lawyers with $1? I don't know anybody.
I want to fix this terrible thing that's happened to our country. This is just on principle, but it's just so corrupt right now.
If there's one question in 30 seconds that you want answered that these documents may answer, what would it be?
Well, who's responsible for all this? There's obviously a lot of people that had some culpability, but let's see, who did what to whom. And so,
I can't wait to find that out.
It's going to be hilarious.
A good beginning for the story of Carter Page is June 16th, 2015.
I think President Trump, then candidate Trump, from the moment he came down the escalator in the middle of 2015, had a great vision for the direction that the world should head and, U.S.'s role in it. And I wanted to help out in any way that I can.
It's been reported that you assisted the FBI years ago in a case of corporate espionage by a Russian, sort of Russian spy case. Is that true?
You know, I had alluded to the fact that, you know, I'd helped out CIA and FBI going back decades. So
how did that come about?
Going back to my years in the military, I had a lot of relationships.
In September of 2016, shortly before the presidential election, Yahoo News published a story linking Page to Russian operatives. Page says it was part of a government-led propaganda campaign to leak accusations about him and create an air of suspicion about Trump. Though he says he'd never met Trump, he was in an orbit that likely would have allowed the FBI to capture candidate, then President-elect Trump, in the surveillance dragnet. Again, something I'm not sure Americans know, but if you are a target and you've been wiretapped, the government is allowed to, or allows itself to also surveil everyone who's in touch with you and everyone who's in touch with those people, at least 2 layers back.
Yes.
You communicated with people, including Steve Bannon,
yes,
who were talking to President Trump.
Yes.
Therefore, would have or could have been wrapped up in the same surveillance.
Absolutely, absolutely. My biggest concern throughout this has been the damage that it's done to the country. And so I always sort of laughed it off. And I think that in some ways that was a negative cycle in a way, because sometimes if I'm laughing at these people, they almost want to come after you even harder to really bring you down. So, but, you know, I was always more concerned about the damage that it was doing to the Trump administration and other people.